You're listening to Advice from Your Advocates, a show where we provide elder law advice to professionals who work with the elderly and their families.
Welcome back to Advice from Your Advocates. I'm Bob Manner. I'm a board-certified elder law attorney, and I'm very excited about our guest today. We've got Jennifer Kaufman, and she's the author and the founder of First Response Autism. So, Jennifer, can you give us a little introduction about yourself?
Certainly. I am located here in northern New Jersey. I am a school principal at a school for learners with autism, and I am also the grandmother of an 8-year-old grandson who also has autism.
Wow, that's fascinating that you have both perspectives. So how long have you been a principal for then?
Overall, I've been a principal for about 20 years, but at this particular school, I've been there for 6 years.
Okay. And so were you in a more traditional school prior to that?
You know, I've always been in special education, and my schools have always had an autism component. There might have been a few classrooms. This is the first time I am at a school that is just strictly an autism population.
Okay, very interesting. So I've told you I really want to talk about your first response autism, which is training for police and first responders and campus security teams on ways to best support autism and neurodivergent individuals in their communities. I'm really excited about hearing about that, but I'd like to start off with your book. So again, a great name for a book, Grandparenting on the Spectrum, A Journey from Both Sides of the Desk. Tell us about your book, what kind of motivated you to write the book, and what you hope people get out of the book.
Certainly. Well, you know, as a professional in the field, I had a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge and access to information that, like, the typical person would not have. And when my grandson was diagnosed, I immediately thought, aha, I can bring all of this information to my daughter. And it caused some problems because my daughter wasn't looking for the school principal with the knowledge. She was looking for mom and grandma to be there in other capacities. And that really got me thinking that I am probably not the only person. Maybe other people don't have that education background, but grandparents have a lot of parenting experience that they bring to the table. And this is a very different situation and different dynamic. And that's what motivated me to write my book.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I can definitely see that from the standpoint of you have a certain level of expertise, but you're also a family member, and it gets, difference in partly the way it's perceived, but also just the personalness of it. It's one thing I find it that when I'm giving advice to folks about a parent with dementia or something like that it's much more difficult when it affects my own family than if I'm speaking to a family that I don't, have that personal connection with. Is that something similar to what you're suggesting?
That is exactly what I'm suggesting. I'm sure it is very similar from your side of the desk as well.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about, if you don't mind, I'd like to get right into the First Response Autism. How'd that come about? What is it? What do you do? How do you do the trainings? And tell us more about the organization.
Sure. You know, it came about, I kept hearing and reading news stories about situations where autistic individuals were not treated appropriately for a variety of reasons. But then, interestingly, I have a little house, we call it in here in New Jersey, down the shore, and I have a deck that overlooks a main road. And I would see police officers trying to interact with individuals, often children, who were unable to speak. But it was obvious they were lost because, they were in bathing suits with no shoes on, running down the street, and watching police officers struggle to communicate, struggle to determine who this child was, where were his people, and just thinking about how, with a little bit of training and knowledge in terms of de-escalating a situation, when somebody is unable to speak to them, when somebody is not being difficult, it's not that they're giving someone a hard time or giving a police officer a hard time. They are having a hard time. And that shift in perspective really was something that I brought to my training sessions. I'm not, talking from a highly clinical perspective. I'm not talking from a hands-on, this is how you de-escalate situation perspective, but I am just speaking from someone with knowledge of You give somebody a little time and you understand what their needs are and you're better able to support them, you can really circumvent a crisis situation.
This can be, I imagine, particularly difficult with autism in that there might be a non-communicative person with autism or at least have some communication challenges. So that probably, even when there is an attempt to de-escalate, that can be very challenging if the person isn't able to communicate in the way that we expect.
Correct. You're seeing somebody in a time of crisis, and a typical person in a time of crisis isn't always able to communicate effectively. But now you're taking somebody who has communication challenges to begin with, and you're asking them to state their name and their address, and what are you doing here, and have you been drinking today, and all of the questions that are routine questions, and where answers are expected. But now you have somebody that is unable to answer, and it's not that they're doing it intentionally, it's that they can't
Hmm.
communicate effectively.
I noticed that, you have a conversation about changes as, that we're often thinking about autism in children and youth, and that I'd like to hear your perspective on changes as we grow up with autism or, adolescence and then into adulthood.
Well, the whole transition from a system where a child or a young adult is supported through their school system, they hit the age of 21 here in New Jersey, and there's a sudden drop off
Mhm.
in services and in educational support. And that is something that profoundly affects not only the individual, but their entire family, grandparents included.
Right. Yeah. Fortunately, in Michigan, we have until age 26. But I noticed my wife is an occupational therapist that worked with children, and that when I talked to her about the services that are offered, often once we get into sort of the teenage years, they kind of scale back on some of the services, which I found very interesting because, obviously, early services can be really helpful in developing skill sets, but it's more intense in the younger kids, the options that are available, at least through the Michigan public school system.
Yeah, they call it the services cliff. It's like at a particular age, they literally fall off a cliff and are unable to continue what worked for them in the past. It's
Hmm.
really unfortunate. Everyone is sort of underprepared for that drop off,
Hmm.
right? And now you've got employment issues, housing issues, relationship issues, guardianship, all of this. And in the meantime, you want your child, your young adult to be a working active part of the community and have those opportunities that are appropriate for them. So where do you even begin?
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
From a legal perspective, that's one of the things that we definitely have conversations about. And when a child turns 18, they're considered an adult, regardless of whether they have autism or other learning related issues or spectrum related issues. And so sometimes well intentioned folks will say, oh, well, you better get guardianship for this 18-year-old now. And our answer is typically, well, maybe if that's necessary. But often, self-determination, the problem with guardianship is you're really taking away the person's right to make their own decisions, legal rights to make their own decisions. And so if we can do something short of that, if we can have, supportive decision making and things like that, as opposed to full guardianship and maybe powers of attorney and things like that, so that the parents can still have access or other loved ones can still have help with decision making and finances and such. But, sometimes it's necessary that guardianship is the appropriate answer. But we always look at it as it's definitely not the first choice, that we explore other options first.
It sort of goes right along with that least restrictive environment when you're
Right.
determining an educational placement. Well, in terms of guardianship, the least restrictive as it can be is more advantageous to the individual.
So tell me more about your school work, because I know, that certainly obviously is a push that we have, and you're going to have to tell me the right terminology to use, but where we don't have separate classrooms and things like that for everybody. But then there are schools like the school that you're at right now where I'm guessing maybe that is sort of the more intense needs are the students that go to the school that you're the principal of. And so how is that decision made as to whether to have what you said, sort of the least restrictive environment versus having the specialties of the school that you're at?
Sure, and that is a really good question, and it's a really an answer that involves a team of people, and that team could include the teachers, administrators, of course, the parents, therapists, anybody who's worked and knows the history of the child can then plan and decide where the most appropriate placement would be. At
Mm-hmm.
my particular school, it's a one-to-one school, so every student has somebody there supporting them. And we do use ABA. We also look at the child very holistically, and our goal isn't for them to succeed within the walls of our school. The goal is for them to succeed out into the community. And a
Right.
large part of what we do is we take them out into the community for community-based instruction and also for work-based learning.
That's great. Well, I'd love to circle back on the issue with regard to the first responders. Tell me more about the organization. Is this just something that you do locally in New Jersey? Is it something that you have others that provide trainings? What does that look like?
So this is something that I do locally here in New Jersey, but I also do it on a wider scale via Zoom. I could travel to areas if need be, but I find that doing it through Zoom gives people the same opportunities as when we're in person.
Hmm.
I started out training police departments, and that
Hmm.
has evolved to a broader first response space. And I'm also now going onto college campuses and working with security teams in order to support their own efforts to support their students, because there are students who are neurodivergent and who have autism who attend college and live on campus or visit the campus. And so we talk a lot about different situations that they find themselves in as to how to best support those students.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm glad to hear about the inclusion of the college campuses and such, and there's probably a different level of training and experience that the security on college campuses has versus the fire department versus the first responders in the police department. And it must be a little bit challenging because that is a broad perspective, and the first responders come with different backgrounds and different experiences, and so that must be challenging to make sure that you're conveying and helping them learn techniques for decentralizing and creating a better communication system.
Yes, it can be. And I found that really meeting with the organization beforehand
Mhm.
and planning out, what are their needs and how can I best provide the information to support them? Because often there is some kind of de escalation training that might mention neurodiverse individuals. There might be some kind of online trainings that they're getting. But having somebody in the room where they can ask very specific questions about, I had somebody once ask me about what if a student is having a really difficult time and a big behavior on a school bus? Do we take
Mhm.
out the kids or do we leave the child on the bus? And having conversations that are very specific to the needs of the community. I mentioned that I have a beach house, and that in that community, I spoke to the police a lot about what to do on the boardwalk when you have a crowd
Mhm.
around you, and what to do on the ocean. Interestingly, 93, and I always like to mention this, 93% of deaths, accidental deaths among people with autism involve water.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a very high
Wow.
rate. I always say it may as well be 100% because that is such a
Wow.
high number. And that's a statistic from 2 years ago, but I'm sure it is the same.
Wow.
And just knowing that will change the way someone will or an organization will approach a missing person when you know that they have autism.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would have never guessed that. That is brand new information for me, and it wouldn't have even occurred to me that that would be the case. So that's particularly interesting in beach communities and such. But really, every community has pools and things like that. So
Absolutely.
it's interesting on the college campuses. I have one daughter that goes to a large, international university, the University of Michigan, and then I have my son goes to a small tech College and Michigan Tech, and definitely a difference in the way that they approach this, and just seeing how they can be much more supportive of the students and their needs with regard to adjusting to the community, from 18 years old, but beyond that. And the small technical university seemed to go above and beyond, the large international university that has all the resources, and for obvious reasons. But I was really pleased when I learned about some of the strategies they use to help adults, I guess, over 18, adjust to all of the changes of joining a campus community like that.
That's good to hear. And, even that the concept that over the age of 21 or maybe it's 18, parents aren't really entitled to the information about their kids' grades or, what's happening with them on campus. And so talking to colleges about coming up with a system so that maybe the student provides the name of a trusted friend when they're in
Mhm.
crisis versus a parent, because a school can't just call a parent and say, like, hey, this is going on with your child, your young adult. So having those conversations and having colleges look at through a different lens at how to best support their population can be very helpful.
Yeah, at Michigan Tech, we just did the orientation, and everything has to be done through the student, meaning that our access as parents was limited to what the student clicks the box to give us access to. And
Right.
they're an adult unless, now I've got Savannah, our producer, here in the background, and you have to remind me the name of the form. FERPA form, yeah.
FERPA,
So
yes.
all of the universities have this for access, and so one of the things that we've kind of gone viral on is conversations with kids going off to school and why they should maybe consider giving someone financial power of attorney, medical advocacy, because they are an adult now. And if they still want their parents' involvement, yes, it's nice to have that form through the school, but some of the interactions might be outside of the university campus. So we always talk about if they were in the hospital, are the parents going to have access to the information? If they got arrested, are
Mhm.
the parents going to be able to assist with that? And so we got mostly very positive response to our instructions that anybody over 18 should have some basic legal documents in place, appointing those people they love and trust to be able to assist. And there were some feedback from some probably younger people that said, "Well, I'd never give my parents that authority," and that's the point. If they're an adult, they can choose not to, too. And so,
Absolutely.
but most of us just don't think about it when we're that young that might come to be where we would need the help of somebody more experienced. And this is even more true, obviously, in a situation where the autism or other spectrum issues where there might be some additional difficulty in learning the transition time. So that's great to hear about the advocacy that you do with first responders. And so if we have any first responder, organizations that are interested, what is the best way for those organizations to begin a conversation with you about doing some training?
They can reach out to me through my website at firstresponseautism.com.
That's great. And then you have an online community too, both on Instagram and Facebook. And so I'm wondering if that's a lot of other grandparents that are seeking advice, or maybe just the parents of them, and the best ways to create those interactions and sometimes create those boundaries, I would imagine. So tell us a little bit more about that community and more about the book and how it helps folks adjust to all the things that they might bring to the advantages of the families, but also making sure that we're doing so in the right way that isn't an interference or overstepping boundaries.
Sure. On Facebook, our community is facebook.com/grandparenting on the spectrum. And on Instagram, it's /grandparenting on the spectrum. So it's pretty easy to remember. All of my resources can be found at jenkaufman.com. And you'd be able to see where, I sort of bring all the websites together
Hmm.
And so if you just remember my name, Jen Kaufman with one N, add the .com at the end, you can go right there and see everything in one place. I'm also providing, interestingly, this has evolved into a corporate training because now I'm
Oh, great.
having companies reaching out looking for some support from their HR people in supporting neurodiverse employees and clients. And that's been an interesting shift to add to these other two groups that I'm helping out.
Well, what do you hope that your audience gains, especially from your book? So, who it might be someone that should pick up your book, and what do you hope that they learn from that and gain from the work that you've done?
I really want people who read my book in particular to understand that they're not alone
Hmm.
and that there are simple strategies that they can put in place that will improve relationships, not only with their grandchild, but with their adult children as well. That was my primary focus. And I do believe overall that communication and implementing strategies like giving somebody more processing time when you ask them a question. It's really not all that complicated,
Hmm.
and really listening when a parent of a child with autism says that they need something, and not to judge or criticize, but to really support and listen and provide what's being asked for. I think that communication is an issue for people with autism. It doesn't matter degree of autism they have, communication is an issue. And learning how to support and listen is really crucial to understanding.
One of the difficulties with autism, because they talk about the spectrum, and it really is very interesting because I have a nephew that is nonverbal. He's in his 20s, and that can be very challenging because he looks like an adult male. He's a tall, athletic looking boy in his 20s, and if you perceive him without, he usually wears funny t-shirts and things like that, and he's got a nice personality, like he loves to have that. But the other day he was over and he was wearing a shirt like his dad might wear. It was a button-up shirt with a collar. And it really kind of threw me off a little bit because those visual reminders, someone who didn't know the specifics of his inability to communicate, his nonverbalness, really would have probably interacted with him in a different way because he was dressed so more professionally that day. And so it must be very difficult for families trying to interact with the community anywhere along the spectrum, but particularly in the more difficult and non-communicative autism. Any advice for families and folks about how to sort of give people a heads up or give them some perspective as they're interacting with their children or their grandchildren so that we can get in front of any potential miscommunication or problems?
So, it really all depends on the family and, of course, the individual and how they'd like to be perceived. We have young adults that can communicate, but sometimes they're difficult to understand. And so they carry with them a communication device, an iPad or a tablet with some kind of app on it that helps them piece together sentences and communicate when they're not able to be understood. Their family and friends might understand them, but the
Right.
cashier at the grocery store might not. So that's one strategy. Some families like to come right out and say, this young man has autism or this young man has communication challenges. I'll speak for him, or let's listen carefully and give him some time to process what he wants to say. It's very individualized. And I think understanding that and supporting that, I think that community members who don't deal with an autistic person in their lives, but are on the periphery, outside looking in, really need to educate themselves a little bit and understand that a little bit of time can work wonders. Or just paying attention and looking for cues can really help support somebody where otherwise you're just going through your day and expecting everyone to communicate with you the same way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great
Yeah.
advice. So I wanted to make sure we go through the ways that people can interact with you again. So you've got jenkaufman.com, you've got
Hmm.
your Facebook and Instagram groups, and then you've got your other website, grandparenting on the spectrum.com and firstresponseautism.com. So you've
Yes,
got a lot of irons
there's a
in the
lot.
fire there. Yeah.
Certainly, it keeps me very busy.
Plus a full-time job as a principal. So that's great. Well, very much appreciate the advice that you've given us today, and any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners that may have. I mean, well, seems like almost everyone has a family member or a loved one or someone they know that has folks that could benefit from the information that you provide. So, any thoughts that you want to leave with our listeners?
I think that family members need to show up, and the
Mhm.
family members need to understand that they're not going to do it perfectly, but that should not stop them from showing up and just being there for a family who has somebody in it with autism, and making sure that you're the consistent person and you can be counted on is really crucial to the success of everybody.
That's very good advice. So, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
For everyone, if you enjoyed this podcast, remember that you can find advice from your advocates in anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to be the first to know about the next episode, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can go to our website at manorlawgroup.com or our YouTube page under Manor Law Group. And you can either hear our podcasts or watch us talk. In most cases, we have a video that goes along with it. So thanks again, and don't forget to subscribe to Advice from Your Advocates.